Hello, everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Tonight, our extra special guest is Dr. Seema Mehta, infectious disease specialist, who's going to talk to us about solid organ transplant recipients and COVID 19. Uh, Dr. Mehta is board certified in internal medicine and infectious disease by the American Board of Internal Medicine. She practices at the University of Pittsburgh Physicians Department of Medicine, Division of Infectious Diseases, and is affiliated with many, I do mean many, hospitals in the UPMC system. She completed her fellowship at Ronald Reagan UCLA Medical Center, her residency at Tufts Medical Center, and medical school degree at SNNY at Buffalo Jacobs School of Medicine and Biomedical Sciences. So we got to put our Poindexter on tonight. We're with a smart lady. Um, Doc is also a clinical assistant professor in infectious diseases at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center. Prior to that, she was practicing transplant and oncology infectious diseases for 6 years at Johns Hopkins University. Presently, she not only attends the transplant and oncology infectious disease services at UPMC, but she also provides telemedicine infectious disease care at other hospitals throughout the United States. Her research interests include CMV, multiple drug resistant bacteria in transplant and oncology populations, antibiotic stewardship in transplant and oncology populations, and telemedicine access for transplant patients. She currently resides in Colorado with her military husband, and in her free time, she enjoys knitting, oil painting, and hiking. Please give a very warm welcome to Dr. Mehta. Doc, how are you doing tonight?
Good. Thank you for having me.
Did I state everything correctly in the introduction?
Yes, you did.
All right, we got that right for a change. Please tell us a little bit about where you grew up, your education, and your employment history.
So I grew up in Southern California in a city called Lancaster, which is about 70 miles northeast of Los Angeles. It's still part of LA County. Um, I went to undergrad at UCLA, where I got a bachelor's degree in molecular cell developmental biology. Then I went on to med school at SUNY Buffalo and did my internship and residency in internal medicine at Tufts Medical Center, which is in Boston. And then I moved back to Los Angeles and did my fellowship in infectious diseases at UCLA. And there I stayed on for an extra year beyond the traditional infectious disease fellowship duration to get additional training in transplant and oncology infectious diseases and to get my master's degree in clinical research. Um, After that, I moved back to the East Coast, where I took my first job at Johns Hopkins University as an assistant professor in infectious disease. Um, while I was there, I attended on the transplant and oncology infectious disease service. So I was taking care of patients who primarily had those conditions. I spent 6 years working there, and during my last 3 years there, I was also assistant clinical director. Once COVID hit, I also attended on the service that we created to specifically care for transplant and oncology patients who had COVID. So we had a dedicated COVID service with those patients. And then in the midst of my time at Hopkins, I met my now husband, who is in the military. He was stationed out there at the time. We got married, thankfully, before COVID hit. And soon thereafter, he got orders to be stationed out here in Colorado. So in late 2020, we moved out this way to Colorado. And shortly after moving here, I took the job at University of Pittsburgh Medical Center doing telemedicine. So I'm able to work primarily remotely, and I see patients who are admitted in various hospitals throughout the country. Um, who have infectious disease complications, and these can be both transplant and non-transplant patients. And I also spend portions of the year out in Pittsburgh attending on their transplant and oncology infectious disease service in person as well. So that's kind of me in a nutshell.
Okay, pretty busy. Um, what we want to discuss today is solid organ transplant recipients, like kidney transplant recipients and COVID-19, particularly in light of the Omicron subvariants BQ.1 and BQ.1.1. Doctor, please talk to us about the current COVID-19 vaccine landscape as it exists today in December of 2022.
Yeah, so the current vaccine landscape was, pretty much just the two main mRNA vaccines, plus we had a protein recombinant vaccine called Novavax that was released, and then we also had the J&J vaccine, which is an adenoviral vector vaccine. So we had these four vaccines available to us, since over the course of late 2020 until now. I think the thing that has changed most recently in the landscape is the addition of a newest booster that's an mRNA vaccine as well. Both Pfizer and Moderna have their own versions of it, but it is called a bivalent vaccine. And up until then, we had monovalent vaccines, which essentially stands for one, mono meaning one, because it was geared towards just the original strain of COVID. Um, Now, with the bivalent vaccine, it is geared towards not only the original strain, but also the Omicron strain, specifically BA.4 and BA.5, which BQ.1 and BQ.1.1 are substrains of the BA.5 Omicron strain. So, we have this newest booster, which has essentially replaced any need for other boosters at this point in time. So that's kind of the biggest change in the landscape. So we still have our primary series vaccines, and then now this bivalent booster. So I think that's the biggest change, but that's kind of the landscape at present.
Okay. I read in the New York Times that Dr. Fauci was hopeful that there would be a reduced COVID threat this winter, provided that Americans got their updated booster shot ahead of the holidays. Can you please explain what is meant by this, and are you as optimistic as Dr. Fauci is?
Yeah, so I think what he was meaning was that if Americans were fully vaccinated and boosted with any and all available and advised booster doses well before the holiday season, then we could potentially decrease the circulation of this virus. In other words, it takes immunity in the community to decrease the burden of the virus. The more people that are vaccinated, then there's less chance for the virus to actually cause infection. Um, and as a result, we'd have reduced spread and just an overall decreased incidence of the virus causing infection. Um, Unfortunately, I don't think I'm as optimistic, only because now that time is kind of showing us what's happening on the vaccine side of things, people are not getting boosted. So, unfortunately, I think our boosting rates are rather low. And as a result, we are still seeing a fair amount of Omicron strains circulating in the community. And I think in certain parts of the country, there are upticks in cases now that winter has rolled around and the holiday season is here, and people are spending more time indoors and gathering as well for various holiday events. It certainly increases the risk and the spread of COVID. So I am unfortunately not as optimistic. Perhaps earlier, prior to the holiday season, I may have been, but just seeing the turnout for the vaccine booster, I'm a little concerned that we're not headed in the right direction, unfortunately, for this winter.
Please discuss if there are known variants and variant classifications and definitions, and what the potential issues are they raise for transplant recipients and kidney patients. Variants being monitored, variants of interest, variants of concern, and variants of high consequence, which I have been told there aren't any of those cases, fortunately, in the US. Can you talk to us a little bit about this?
Yeah, so you named the four major classifications of monitoring that happens in the US as well as in the world. Both the CDC and the WHO have taken on the task of monitoring these. So variants being monitored are essentially variants that are at no risk to public health. In other words, they're circulating at very low levels. Not really having an impact on the community or our treatments or vaccine efficacy, et cetera. There are no variants being monitored at this moment in time in the sense that there's none that are at low risk to the population. Variants of interest are those that have the potential to have impact on the spread of the virus, severity of disease, whether or not our testing capabilities are good for detecting these viruses, and impact on our treatments and vaccines. There are, you know, no significant potential viruses or viral strains out there at this moment in time that are fitting in that category. We continue to watch all strains of the virus as a whole, including the original strain. We still monitor for any emergence of that again. But the big category is the variants of concern, which shows evidence of impact on spread, severity, testing, treatment, and vaccination. So the variants of concern at present are specifically the Omicron strains, BA.2, BA.4, and BA.5, and now also the substrains of BA.5, BQ.1, and BQ.1.1. So those strains are certainly ones that we need to keep our eyes on. They currently make up about half of the cases that we're seeing, but prediction models in the US and in Europe indicate that it's likely going to be upwards of 80% or more come early 2023. So it just seems like it's on the rise. In terms of what impact that means for transplant recipients, generally speaking, the Omicron strain has not been causing significantly severe disease in the general population. That being said, when it comes to transplant recipients, all bets are off. It doesn't matter whether it's a milder strain in the general population. When your immune system is weakened due to medications that you take to maintain the health of your transplanted organ, those immunosuppressive drugs put you at high risk for developing severe infection from COVID, regardless of how mild that strain may be elsewhere. And it also increases the risk of death and hospitalization due to COVID as well. So I think it's when it comes to transplant recipients, knowing that there's still newer strains coming out and circulating, and their circulation is growing in the community, I think it's reason to be concerned and to closely monitor yourself and other people who have transplanted organs.
Okay. The at-risk group. What vaccines are available and what groups of people are considered to be at high risk? Are they people like solid organ transplant people, kidney transplant recipients?
Yeah. So as I kind of alluded to earlier, we have our four vaccines available for primary series vaccination. So that includes our mRNA vaccines, which are the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines. We have the recombinant protein vaccine, which is Novavax, and then our adenoviral vector vaccine, which is the J&J vaccine. So all of these are available as monovalent vaccines for the primary series. So in other words, the initial doses you get. And then, as I mentioned, we have the Pfizer or Moderna for the bivalent booster dose. So all of these are currently available. For the primary vaccine series, if you get Pfizer, it's one shot followed by your second shot at least as early as 3 weeks. Some people can get it as late as 8 weeks, but for people who are of high risk, it's recommended to stick to the earlier side of 3 weeks. And then for those who are at high risk, specifically immunocompromised patients, they are recommending to complete your primary series with a third shot, which is given about 4 weeks after that second shot. Similarly for Moderna, you have your first shot, second shot 4 weeks later, and then a third shot 4 weeks after that. For Novavax, we give one shot and then again 3 to 8 weeks later, depending on whether or not you're immunocompromised. Ideally, if you're immunocompromised, we say stay on the earlier side. You get your second shot. Novavax is currently not approved or authorized for a third dose in immunocompromised patients. And then the J&J vaccine, the appeal to that one is that it is one dose. However, if you're immunocompromised, we recommend that you take either the Pfizer or Moderna vaccine 4 weeks after you receive the J&J vaccine to complete your primary series. Then after any of these, 2 months later, you are eligible to receive your booster with the bivalent dose. Now, when it comes to those who are at high risk groups are in fact immunocompromised. So those who are solid organ transplant recipients receiving medicines that suppress their immune system. Other high-risk groups include those who are pregnant, those who have multiple medical conditions, including things like diabetes, obesity. Patients who are on dialysis also fall into that category. And then the other high-risk group that we always talk about and think about is patients over the age of 65. We know that the older you are, the more you're at risk for severe infection with COVID. So all those categories of people really need to be sure to take their primary series and get the booster. Immunocompromised patients, again, it's very important to recognize that your primary series, if you're getting the mRNA vaccines, so Pfizer or Moderna, is actually 3 initial doses. So yeah, I think transplant centers across the country have been very good about getting that message out and have been ensuring that their transplant recipients are in fact, fully vaccinated with the primary series of 3 doses.
Okay. One thing I noticed when I was doing research for the broadcast is that the authorized age groups have changed. Can you please talk to us about the authorized age groups who may take these vaccines and recent changes, and that would include the bivalent booster?
Right. So the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines are authorized for those 6 months and older. So the youngest you can give those 2 vaccines is 6 months. J&J in particular is for 18 years and older. And for the booster, those 2 are authorized for ages 5 and older. And to my knowledge, those are the most recent updates to the vaccine authorized age groups.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about something off the menu for a moment, Doc. Tell us a little bit about Evusheld TM? What are the CDC's requirements to receive it, and what exactly is it for?
So, Evusheld is a monoclonal antibody therapy that we primarily use for pre-exposure prophylaxis. So, primarily in our transplant population. So, it's very much reserved for immunocompromised individuals. Um, the vaccine efficacy, as we know it, is actually not that great in transplanted patients or patients who are on immunosuppressing medications. So one way to augment our repertoire of antibodies in our system that are available to help fight infection should we get exposed to it, is to give you monoclonal antibodies. So Evusheld is actually two different monoclonal antibodies combined into one. Um, and you need to generally wait 2 weeks after you receive a vaccination dose before you can start your Evusheld um, injections. There are two injections. Each dose is about 300 milligrams, I believe. And you basically receive this as a means to, as I said, augment your antibody response and to have additional protection. And it lasts in your system for about 6 months. So theoretically, we could give it to you every 6 months if we needed to or could. It's just challenging sometimes to get access to it. And so that's been the one tough thing with Evusheld, but most transplant centers have been doing their best to ensure that their transplant recipients are getting at least the additional 2 doses to at least provide some protection, especially earlier on when, you know, when Omicron in particular was first rising, and even prior to that with the Delta strain and whatnot. So we've primarily been using Evusheld as pre-exposure prophylaxis.
Okay. The CDC has made certain recommendations for the mixing of COVID-19 products for your primary doses, boosters for children, and bivalent. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So generally speaking, it is ideal if you can complete your primary series with the same manufacturer. So in other words, if you get the first dose with Pfizer, it's best to get your second, and if you're immunocompromised, your third dose with the same manufacturer with Pfizer. Same goes with Moderna, et cetera. If by some reason it's unavailable or you no longer have the ability to get that same manufacturer, in those extreme situations, it is okay to switch. But again, it's advised and preferred if you complete the primary series with the same manufacturer. Now, the booster is a different story. You can do boosters with either manufacturer. So it doesn't matter what you completed your primary series with. So if you got Pfizer for your primary series, you can certainly do Moderna for your booster. It's absolutely okay to mix in those settings. There's some data, some literature to suggest that mixing with the boosters, so getting Pfizer for your primary, for example, and Moderna for your booster, or vice versa, has some increased efficacy. But, I think in general, um, as long as you can get a booster, that's the best. You just need to get something on board. So really, if it's the same or the other, it really doesn't matter at that point.
Okay. How frequently should you re-up your booster shot?
Yeah, so prior to the bivalent, we had recommended, 3 doses for the primary series, followed by a booster, and then we had an additional booster that came out later on. And so theoretically, some patients out there have received 5 doses of the original vaccine before even going on to get a bivalent booster. Now that the bivalent is available, which contains elements from the original strain of COVID as well as elements from the Omicron strain, we don't need those boosters in between. So it's recommended you finish your primary series, then 2 months later get the bivalent booster. And if you're one of those people who got up to 5 doses, prior to the fall of this year, that's okay. You can still get the bivalent booster. You are currently eligible for it. And it's at this point, we don't know exactly how many more boosters we're going to need. I can't say with certainty if this is going to be like a flu shot where we take it yearly, or if it's going to be more frequent than that every 6 months. It's still hard to say. I think it's still because the virus continues to evolve and mutate, and essentially evade our vaccine. We may be in store for some additional doses in the future. How often or how frequent, I'm not sure yet. But I can say that, vaccine immunity does wane with time. So boosters will certainly be in our future.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about the current group of COVID-19 vaccines being administered at the same time with other non-COVID vaccines, like the COVID vaccine being administered at the same time as the flu shot. Can you talk to us what the rules are about that?
Yeah. So earlier on in the pandemic, we were a little hesitant to give the COVID vaccine with other vaccines out of concern that we weren't really sure what that impact would be on patients receiving more than one vaccine at a time. But over the course of the vaccine being available and us continuing on in this journey of the pandemic, there is limited data out there, and based on this limited data, the CDC does advise that you can receive your COVID vaccine in addition to the flu shot, the pneumonia shot, your shingles vaccine. Pretty much any vaccine out there you can get at the same time as your COVID shot. They simply recommend that if it's 2 shots, to split them between the 2 arms, or to give it in different locations on the body so you're not having one arm that's completely sore the next day. And unfortunately, you would have 2 arms then completely sore the next day. Um, but also, the other option is to potentially space it out by 1 inch on the arm. So give 1 shot in one area, and then about an inch or more away, give the second shot. Um, but generally for COVID, if you're combining it with another vaccine, we recommend doing COVID in one arm and the other vaccine, whatever it may be, in the other arm. So you can certainly do that. The only vaccine that I am aware of where giving it around the same time as the COVID vaccine is the monkeypox vaccine. So if you are someone who meets criteria for the monkeypox vaccine, then you should wait at least 4 weeks before getting your COVID vaccine. So you should prioritize the monkeypox vaccine over the COVID one, um, according to the CDC at this time.
Okay. Let's talk for a minute about the situation where you get COVID-19 before or during your vaccine series. Should you still get the vaccine? What are the rules that the CDC has for that?
Yeah. So you should still certainly complete your vaccine series. So whether you get COVID before or in between shots, um, the CDC recommends at this time that you should wait until you are completely recovered from infection and at the very least out of isolation, and you meet criteria for all of that, before considering getting your next dose, whatever part, wherever you are in the series of shots. um Generally speaking, if you've had infection, we know that that usually gives you some antibody protection for about 3 months. So you're probably safe waiting up to 3 months to resume your vaccine shots. um that said, it may be reasonable for transplant patients to discuss with their transplant physician or transplant coordinator, their transplant team in general, when they should receive that shot after getting COVID, because it may be beneficial to actually do it sooner than 3 months in transplant recipients. So that's generally the guidance that we have out there for when to get your shots after having had a bout of COVID.
Okay. Suppose you get your shot and then sometime after your series of shots, that's when you get COVID. What are the rules as far as getting well from COVID and then going back to get another series of shots if you need them?
Yeah, so it's the same rules to my knowledge, is that, if you had your shots, let's say you completed your primary series and you have been, let's say 6 or 8 months and you haven't received a booster, and you get COVID, it's very similar. Though that infection immunity we do think lasts for about 3 months, so you could theoretically wait. But again, with transplant patients, the immune response that we have to both infection and vaccine is on the lower side. So it may be reasonable for individual situations to talk to your transplant team and see about getting that vaccine, whatever you're due for at that time, sooner than 3 months. Only because transplant recipients, are at risk, at a higher risk than the general population for severe infection and death. And so we are seeing people get infected not just a second time, but in some cases a third time and a fourth time. So, reinfection with COVID is a real thing. So any protection you can get, uh, to help with that would be beneficial. And so it is reasonable, and I think it's individualized, which is why I think talking to your transplant physician and your transplant team would make the most sense, because each situation is a little bit different when it comes to transplant recipients.
Okay. I've heard you talk on some of your other videos, and by the way, for our audience, all of the doctor's prior videos, things that she's written, YouTube videos, etc., newspaper descriptions, articles about her are all in the comments to the broadcast. So if you want to check that out, you want to drill down a little bit, it's all there. One of the things I've heard you say over and over again is that immunity wanes over time. How long is immunity currently good for?
Yeah, so it's at this point in time, as far as we can tell, immunity starts to wane in the 6 to 12 month range after receiving your vaccine. Um, the decreased efficacy of the vaccine is compounded not only by the fact that our immunity itself wanes, but it's also compounded by the fact that this virus is mutating. So as new strains come out, the vaccine becomes less and less effective as well. So not only are we faced with decreased immunity, but we're also faced with strains of this virus evading our immune response that the vaccine has been set up to create. And as a result, we're seeing more and more infections again. So 6 to 12 months, though, seems to be the range in which we're starting to see that decline happen.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about current efforts to come up with better vaccines. Are there current efforts to try and come up with better COVID-19 vaccines?
Yes. So there are efforts being undertaken all over the world to come up with vaccines that may be better, more effective, um, easier in terms of the number of doses that may be available. You name it, there's efforts that are being done. As the WHO actually has a tracker online, um, telling you specifically how many vaccines are in clinical development and how many are in preclinical development, and this is worldwide. Um, as of the end of November, when I last checked it, there was about 175 vaccines in clinical development and about 199 in preclinical development. So there's a fair number of vaccines out there that are currently being investigated and developed in order to hopefully improve what we currently have.
Okay. If you receive antibody therapy, how long should you defer receiving the vaccination, the COVID-19 vaccination?
Yeah, so when it comes to monoclonal antibodies, Evusheld, when you're talking about pre-exposure prophylaxis, you want to get your COVID vaccine, at least the first shot that you're due for, and then wait about 2 weeks, and then start your Evusheld series. You can continue with the vaccine series on schedule after that, but it's just that initial 2-week period that you want to wait between the vaccine administration and starting Evusheld. When it comes to treatment, say you got sick and you received some sort of monoclonal antibody for treatment, we used to recommend a 90-day wait period between monoclonal antibody, or something that we used to use even much earlier on in the pandemic, something called convalescent plasma, which is also similar. It's a bunch of immune cells, including antibodies, that we can administer to someone to help augment their body's ability to fight the virus. So in either of those scenarios, we were recommending 90 days between that and receiving a vaccine. The CDC actually now recommends that you can receive the vaccine at any time in relation to receiving a monoclonal antibody for treatment purposes. And their thought is the benefits of the vaccine outweigh any theoretical risk associated with any kind of problems that may arise with your antibody response if you receive monoclonal antibody and then vaccine.
Okay. If you are pre-transplant, when is it best to receive the COVID vaccine in relationship to undergoing your transplant?
So, for most vaccines, we advise that you complete the vaccines at least 2 weeks before you receive your transplant. So, if you are, let's say, getting a kidney transplant from a living donor, it would be wise to schedule it after completing the COVID series and any boosters.
Okay. Let's talk for a minute about the J&J vaccine, the Janssen vaccine. What is the current status of the Janssen vaccine, and is it preferable to receive other vaccines over that particular vaccine?
Yeah, so the J&J vaccine it's approved for people, it's authorized for people 18 years and older. Um, some people do get it if they're unable to get the mRNA vaccine. Excuse me. Um, the concerns with the J&J vaccine are primarily for something called TTS, or thrombosis with thrombocytopenia syndrome, which is essentially a situation where your platelet count drops, but you're also developing blood clots. And these blood clots are happening in unusual locations like the brain or the abdomen, and they can be life-threatening when they happen in these unusual locations. So there is this theoretical concern that existed, that has played out in reality, and we are seeing about um, 9 to 10 or 11 cases per million doses in women, in particular, who are aged 30 to 49. So generally speaking, this happens about 2 weeks after vaccine administration, and it's a real concern. Um, some people still, will take this vaccine and have no issues at all. And actually, regulatory bodies in the U.S. and Europe indicate that it's still beneficial to receive this vaccine because some vaccine is better than no vaccine. So even though these risks exist, we still recommend to receive it. That being said, when it comes to transplant patients, the mRNA vaccines are a bit more studied and also appear to be very well tolerated in that patient population. And so we know more about the efficacy of the mRNA vaccines in transplant recipients than we do with the J&J vaccine in particular. So generally speaking, I think as a whole, we as a transplant community, we tend to recommend the mRNA vaccines for transplant patients.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about people that have autoimmune conditions like lupus and the COVID-19 vaccine. Are these people eligible for enrollment in the COVID-19 vaccine clinical trials, and are there ins and outs to this issue that people need to be made aware of?
Yeah, so the people with autoimmune conditions are generally at high risk for developing severe infection with COVID-19. And they're also at higher risk for having worse outcomes, to include hospitalization and even death. The one autoimmune condition where this is a little bit less certain is actually lupus. But that being said, any autoimmune condition itself does seem to increase your risk. And if you're receiving treatments for the autoimmune condition, generally those treatments suppress the immune system. So if you are receiving immunosuppressive drugs, we do know that that in and of itself also increases your risk for severe infection. So when it comes to vaccines, they are eligible. There are very specific trials that are being conducted, and studies being done to investigate vaccine efficacy in these particular patient populations. And there there are a lot of national registries available out there. And it is actually advisable if you are a person that has one of these conditions to consider registering with these national registries as a means for us to gather more information how COVID affects patients with these conditions, and how the vaccine is affecting patients with these conditions and how efficacious is that vaccine in that patient population. So there's quite a bit of opportunity out there for patients with autoimmune conditions to be involved in vaccine trials uh, currently. I think generally speaking, as I said, these people with these conditions, and in particular, when we think about these people with conditions like autoimmune situations who also have transplanted organs, are a very unique patient population. And so, including these patients in studies, whether it's from the autoimmune perspective or from the transplant perspective, is very beneficial to the medical community and for future care of these patients so that we know how to best approach them, not only in managing COVID infection, but also in preventing COVID infection. So any opportunity that anyone has through their hospital center, through their doctors, or through these national registries, to be involved would be really beneficial.
Okay. Let's talk about the bottom line to recent studies involving solid organ transplant recipients and COVID-19, and perhaps some of the newer studies. Some of the studies you mentioned, March 2021, Johns Hopkins, a European study in April of 2021, an Israeli liver transplant recipient study in April of 21, Israeli study of kidney transplant recipients by 5 of 21, Johns Hopkins studies, and any new study. What is the bottom line about taking vaccinations, in particular for variants, and the fact that we still have breakthrough cases of COVID-19 with these vaccinations?
Yeah. So I think the bottom line across the board when it comes to this literature, specifically looking at transplant recipients and the COVID vaccine, is that the immune response, the antibody response that we generate in transplant recipients is far less than what we're generating in the general population. Um, in other words, these vaccines are just not as efficacious. They're not as good as the general population as compared to them in preventing um, infection, severe infection, hospitalization, death, etc. Um, I think the concern that we have is that not only are these of lesser efficacy, but also as we have newer strains evolving that have the capability to evade any immune response that we may actually have from this vaccine, um, we are, as a result, seeing breakthrough infections. In other words, we're seeing infections happen in patients who, despite vaccination, are getting sick. Um, so the big thing is what we learned from all these studies is that we need additional doses, and that is why immunocompromised patients or patients who are transplant recipients in particular are advised to receive that third dose. Um, the original vaccine trials with the mRNA vaccines, they were touting efficacy rates in the 90s for the general population. When we did studies looking at this efficacy of 2 doses in transplant recipients, these studies were anywhere from 50 to 70%. And so the efficacy rate is much lower. So the addition of the third dose was designed to augment that. And so we got it up more consistently in the 70s for transplant recipients. Um, Now, when we look at antibody titers, we don't know what the magic number is that we need to be considered protected. That number, we do know the higher it is, the better it is, but where is the cutoff? That we're still not really sure. So, even though someone may have a lower antibody response, the general thought is some response is better than no response. So having the vaccine is better than no vaccine.
Okay, great. Let's talk about some take-home points regarding COVID-19 vaccines and solid organ transplant recipients. Do solid organ transplants need to continue to follow the CDC rules to decrease the chances of acquiring or being exposed to COVID-19? And what are those rules, just as a reminder?
Yeah. So because the vaccine is less efficacious in solid organ transplant recipients, it is advised that even if you are fully vaccinated and boosted, that you still adhere to all the CDC guidance in taking precautions to protect yourself. So, in other words, good hand hygiene, um, social distancing, so avoiding large crowds, avoiding indoor crowds or gatherings, and wearing a mask. So any mask is better than no mask. So ideally, it should be well fitting, and if you can get your hands on an N95 or a KN95, it's better than what other options are out there, but generally a mask is better than no mask. So adhering to those guidelines, despite vaccination, is very crucial for transplant recipients because of that idea of breakthrough infection and decreased efficacy of the vaccines. It's important to continue to protect yourself.
Okay. One of the questions I hear all the time is whether or not the safety of the co-vaccines is okay in solid organ transplant recipients. Can you talk to us a little bit about vaccine safety for those of us that have a solid organ transplant?
Yeah. So the vaccines, looking at all the literature that's to date, the vaccines in transplant recipients, specifically the mRNA vaccines, are very well tolerated, and the safety profile appears to be very similar to that of the general population. So we're not seeing any significant side effects that are not being seen in the general population. And one of the theoretical concerns that we always have about vaccines in transplant recipients is, will it induce rejection? Will it cause an episode of rejection? Having that burst of an antibody response to something that's being introduced into your body can theoretically cause a bout of rejection. And we have not seen that play out at all. So thankfully, it appears to be a very safe and well tolerated vaccine for transplant recipients.
Okay. We have a little bit of extra time. Let me ask one question that's been bothering me for a while.
Sure.
What do we do about these patients that have long-term COVID? How are they treated? Do they ever get better? What goes on with that?
Yeah. So long COVID is a very complex situation. Depending on what organ is being affected, and we are seeing all kinds of secondary effects from COVID, including the development of all kinds of conditions involving the lungs, the heart. We're seeing mental health issues as a result of COVID. We're seeing new GI problems. There's been some studies to indicate the development of possible autoimmune conditions as a result of COVID. We're also seeing things like the development of diabetes in people who never had diabetes after they get COVID. So long COVID is a very complex and multifaceted process that, depending on what is affected and what consequence someone is experiencing, will largely determine what kind of care they're receiving after having COVID and having now long COVID. So it really depends, and some people, um, you know, the long COVID effects, it's a spectrum, and some people are on the lower side of the spectrum where they don't feel as much, but they feel a little bit of something going on. And then other people are at the other end of the spectrum where, they have significant symptoms from whatever they're experiencing as a consequence of COVID. And so that too will certainly play into and impact the care that you're receiving and how well one feels. As for how long someone may experience these symptoms, I think that remains to be seen. I think we're only now starting to better understand long COVID now that we've had a couple years under our belt. And now we're seeing the effects of people, survivors from earlier in the pandemic, and seeing what kind of long-term COVID issues they're experiencing now. So I think it's still too early to say, how long these effects will last for, or if they're permanent, how we can manage them effectively to improve quality of life. I think all of that is still very much unfolding before our eyes. But yeah, stay tuned, because I think we'll definitely have more information as time goes on.
Okay. Doctor, is it okay if members of our audience have questions or issues after the broadcast if they contact you by email?
Absolutely.
Okay, and I'm putting up for our audience that's the email address you can write to Dr. to and ask questions. And just so you know, she's really a very nice lady and very accommodating, and she sure put up with your Uncle Jim's nonsense. So don't be afraid to contact her if you need to do that. Before we conclude, Doctor, do you have any final statements or remarks that you wish to make?
I think the big thing to remember is that COVID is still real. COVID is still happening. COVID is still very much in our presence. There was an article in JAMA earlier this year, and the title of the article was COVID-19, the end of the beginning or the beginning of the end. And I think we might be at the end of the beginning. I think what we've experienced may just be the tip of the iceberg, and we're still in for more. But that being said, I also, have to remember a quote from Bill Gates that states treatment without prevention is simply unsustainable. And I think that is very true of COVID. Vaccination and preventative measures are really helpful in terms of making our treatments effective. The less COVID that's circulating, the less mutations that will happen, and the more effective treatment is. And the only way to achieve those initial two steps is by prevention. So, continue to take those measures to protect yourself, continue to prevent COVID for yourself by getting vaccinated. And if you have access to Evusheld, get it. Do the things that you can, work with your transplant team. And, and I do hope that everyone listening to this stays well and healthy.
Terrific. Doctor, what a great experience this has been. I learned so much tonight. I know the people that are watching and will see the replay that they've learned quite a bit too. I thank you very, very much for coming on and speaking to us about this important issue. I have some housekeeping stuff that I have to clean up with my audience. I'm going to go ahead and let you go. I know you're very busy. And again, thank you for taking time to raise awareness and to help educate us about COVID and solid organ transplant.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you for the time. I really had a great time. And please feel free to contact me if any questions come up.
Well, I think, Doc, that somewhere down the road, if there are new developments, I might tap you on the shoulder again because this was so great. So
Absolutely.
I appreciate any help that you can give us.
I'd be happy to do this again.
Excellent. Excellent. All right. Well, Doc, you have a good night. Thank you so much for coming on. I promised you an hour and I'm giving you back a minute. So
Thank you. Thank you. Have a good night.
Have a good night. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, that's our broadcast for tonight about COVID-19 and solid organ transplant recipients and what's going on with all that. Wow, we covered an awful lot of ground in an hour, and as you can see, she's wonderful. What a terrific job she did tonight, helping us out with some really tough questions. And some of those, by the way, were off the cuff. They weren't all questions that had been planned. So I've got broadcasts coming up in the future. So watch this space, and I'll let you know when things are happening. And the next broadcast, I'll make sure I go over what's currently scheduled because I'm now accepting appointments in March and April, and I'm trying to run down some doctors for you, some experts in particular fields. And this time of year around the holidays, it's tough, but your Uncle Jim, I'm persistent. So I'll stay with it until I get it. But until then, you have a good night and take care.